Welcome to the LevelUp conference, everyone. I appreciate you listening into this session. I'm Chris. I work in the technology, media, and telecoms division of S&P Global. And for over a decade now, I've been researching the different technologies and trends when it comes to workforce productivity, collaboration, and employee engagement. I have 25 minutes to take you through my 5 secrets to unlocking productivity. I have a lot to share. I'm pretty sure this is going to fly by, though. And really, I'm speaking to a couple of audiences. If you're someone who just wants some basic guidance around how to be more productive, hopefully you'll find something to learn from during this session. I'll also be trying to speak to, team leaders, divisional leaders who are having to think about that from the perspective of a team of different people needing to find how to optimally work together. And then finally, anyone who has any kind of responsibility over technology strategy or technology decisions when it comes to, the different tools underpinning workforce operations. Again, hopefully you'll also find something in here for you. I'll throw my contact details up at the end if following this session, anyone wants to connect. I would obviously be more than happy to. So here are my 5 sort of secrets to unlocking productivity. I want to just sort of quickly go through them so that you know sort of where I'm going with this. With each one of these, I'm going to be sharing some data, sharing some perspectives, hopefully being persuasive. So the first one I'm going to be taking you through in a moment's time is, really elevate work to a tier 1 asset. Right. So how your company thinks about work reflects not just on how it thinks about productivity and specific business outcomes it wants to achieve, but it also says something about your organization when it comes to employee engagement, to talent management, to company culture. Work is really the proving ground for skilling. It's the seedbed for creativity. And it's where you determine as an organization what operational excellence really means for you. And it should be therefore treated as such. So we'll spend a bit of time thinking about what that can actually mean and look like. The second area I'm going to touch on is to think hubs and spokes, which is to say, when you think about everything that's on your plate, be clear about what is your core focus, what is adjacent, and then work to more clearly connect the two things. So again, I'll show some data and share some thoughts on how that can actually happen. The third one I'm going to be talking to is, go deep and then step back. We're so used to all the kind of messy, low value work, the work about the work, as the phrase goes. And, I think we've somehow arrived at a place where we've deprioritized doing deep and focused work and taking that wide angle lens view. And those are really the 2 modalities we should be spending most of our time on. And so again, I'll be talking a little bit about how that can be achieved. The fourth one we'll look at is, continuous planning and execution. So much gets lost, as I'm sure many of you have experienced, in, poorly defined plans, long planning cycles, and weak follow through. If really you want your teams to be focused, to be aligned, and to be operating in an agile manner, then you need to think about how to, continuously plan and execute in your team, and and what that looks like. And then finally, we'll conclude by thinking about how to let data inform best practice. It inevitably takes effort and dedication deciding and arriving at a set of metrics against which to assess your performance and progress, and indeed to generate insights from raw data. But certainly for high performance teams, this has now moved through the phase of sort of being a nice to have an experimentation to actually now establishing best practice, informing new norms when it comes to operational culture, and deriving stronger execution. So that's another important area. Hopefully I will share some interesting perspectives on. So let's jump into each one of these. So, this is the first one, elevate work to a tier 1 asset. I put this as the first one for a reason. This is perhaps the sort of most macro of these various perspectives I'll share. And I really think the past 3 years of disruption have been, for many businesses, somewhat of a crash course when it comes to what happens when this isn't the case, right? When there hasn't been strategic thought put into how teams work best together, when maybe workflows haven't been thought through enough, and when it's not understood actually how the day-to-day work experience that employees have impacts non-productivity outcomes. So let's just think about this in a little bit more detail. I'm going to first touch on this data, then I'll give some ideas on how to actually do this. So I'm showing two visuals here. If I can direct your gaze to the one on the left-hand side, first of all, this shows the statistically strongest drivers of positive engagement. So, what is driving positive engagement amongst employees? What goes into that? This is actually taken from a regression analysis we did on our employee engagement data. And you'll notice the two yellow highlighted ones in second and seventh place both speak to the tools and technologies that determine the experience of getting work done day to day. Now, historically, the narrative around engagement has really centered on compensation, company values, the kind of manager-managee relationship, all of which are, of course, very important and always will be so. What hasn't, I think, anywhere nearly enough been talked about is how the tools that employees work in and out of day to day actually impact their engagement, not just their productivity, but their engagement. Not only do they, but as you can see from this visual on the left-hand side, they're actually very prominent drivers when it comes to having an engaged workforce. So that's perhaps the first big thing to say. When we're thinking about productivity, realize this isn't just a productivity conversation. This isn't just about output. This is about how good employees feel, how technologies influence that, and all of the things, including productivity, I might add, that flow from that. It's really engagement that unlocks productivity, not the other way around. The second bit of data on the right says something similar, but from a slightly different angle. This is the proportion of employees who say they would likely leave their organization and take another job somewhere else if the only difference was the guarantee of a better day-to-day tech stack, right? So better availability of good tools that would give them a more sort of satisfying day-to-day experience of getting their jobs done. Right. So these numbers, as you can see, are pretty significant, even amongst engaged employees who otherwise are content in their roles. 24% nevertheless would say that they would likely leave and take that other job if they could be guaranteed that better day-to-day experience. And certainly amongst disengaged employees who have some reason, whatever that might be, to not be content in their role, unsurprisingly, that's higher. That's almost 4 in 10 of those employees who say this would likely be a prompt for them to go somewhere else. So, what to do about this? First off, I would say, if you have any kind of control over or input into how your company thinks about its employee experience strategy, then I would really center it around this day-to-day work experience. Company values are important, compensation is important, other things are important. DEI strategies and policies are very important to lots of people. But just look at those top two drivers. People want to get on, create opportunity for themselves, and they want to have a good experience day to day in doing that when they're working in and out of different tools and trying to deliver and be productive and hit their goals. And of course, they want a sense of belonging in their organization. So I would say really try and center much more of how you think about the employee experience around that day-to-day work experience. I would say the second recommendation would be to think about your operational culture. What are the best practices that determine how your teams work? What are the metrics that support that? What is the culture? What are the expectations and accountability that you're setting for your teams? How do you include in this a sense of empowerment and ownership, which teams and individual employees are increasingly looking for these days, in terms of how they themselves define how work happens and what being agile and aligned and focused looks like for them. And then finally, I'd say, now is the time to rethink daily practices. This shift to hybrid working, more distributed and remote working that we've seen happen over the past couple of years, the growing focus many businesses are now placing on trying to embed more resiliency across their workforce operations. All of this requires new thinking about how work actually happens. And, it's the reality for lots of companies that what was done sort of 3-4 years ago won't be suitable, won't cut it anymore. So, just to summarize before we go on to the next area that we're going to look at, elevate work to a tier 1 asset, recognize it as a driver of outcomes beyond just productivity. And, despite the cost pressures which many businesses are when it comes to investing in things like technology, now is the time actually to invest for transformation and not just to keep the lights on. Okay, so let's think about this second area. So thinking hubs and spokes in your tools and relationships. Many of the inefficiencies and frustrations around work come from this sprawl of silos that employees wrangle with every day, lots of applications, too many silos, all the context switching, the work about the work, the difficulties all of that poses for creating the right workflows and for collaborating with others. This is always going to be a challenge, but you can actually do something about it. So again, 2 bits of data here. The data on the left-hand side shows the main technology obstacles that employees say they're struggling with. This is pretty consistent. We've asked this question in our annual employee survey for several years now. It changes a little bit year on year, but not substantially. And essentially what it shows is that the primary sort of bucket of challenges when it comes to technology is silos. It's siloed information, too many apps that don't integrate well with one another, difficulties in collaborating across lots of apps. The data on the right shows somewhat the consequence of that. 2/3 of employees say they struggle with collaboration. And, much of the reason for that is that they don't have enough time to do it. There's too much friction that takes time up elsewhere. There's not knowing who to collaborate with. That's difficult when you're working in and out of either operational silos or technology silos, and, not having the right workflows to collaborate effectively. So again, what can be done about this? I think it's increasingly becoming recognized and important amongst more companies that they have to avoid just having lots of apps that do lots of separate things that aren't integrated, with no sense of architecture behind how they should work together. And just this notion, which many people still follow when making decisions around technology, that technology is there to provide functionality rather than actually help deliver business outcomes. The reality is that amongst more forward-looking companies, they're starting with their business outcomes and they're beginning to view their different teams as part of more integrated sort of end-to-end value streams delivering on those outcomes. And to support that, at least one of the things they're doing is looking to minimize those silos and all of the friction. And they're asking the question, what are the strategic systems that house the important data, workflows, context, people into which it would be useful to actually bring and aggregate assets, whatever they may be, from other apps. In other words, what really are our strategic hubs that we want people to be focusing on and spending their time adding value around, and what are the spokes? So that's definitely a technology question, but actually it's also a relationship one. In fact, that sort of value streams way of thinking, where companies are trying to bring, different business teams, different technical teams together in a sort of more holistic appreciation of how specific outcomes, whether that's customer experience outcomes or something else, are actually delivered against. One of the implications of that way of thinking is that companies are going to have to be much better at orchestrating complex cross-functional working, and different teams will increasingly be coming together and asking questions which maybe they previously would have only have done in their own silo. What goals are we all rolling up to? How do we work together? What do I need to know about sort of your side of the fence, as it were? So one recommendation I would make is to normalize just a basic open house and or provide, clear documentation to clarify how your part of the business works. Explain any unique lexicons that you use, any goals, transparency around sort of key timelines in your calendars might be useful, and obviously articulating where support would be appreciated. Just something as simple as like an easy 101 download, allowing other teams to more easily bridge into your work streams from their side of the fence would actually go a long way. So, in both your own tools and in your collaborations with others, make explicit what your center of gravity is and how that needs to be supported. Clarify your hubs and clarify your spokes. The third one I want to talk about, I think, is a bit of an elephant in the room. It sort of always has been, or has been for a long time. We have somehow convinced ourselves that constant interruptions and the tools that provide those constant interruptions are normal, and that the norm should be that we're always in a state of availability, and that availability signals productivity. I mean, this is, of course, an illusion. I feel as though people really know it's an illusion, and we have always had data from our employee surveys to substantiate that is exactly what it is. We really just need to flip this one and organize ourselves so that we spend most of our time in one of these two modalities. So you're either doing deep, focused work, or you're then stepping back and taking that wide angle, more strategic view on your different priorities. And, really minimize, it's never going to go away, but really minimize all of that low value work that happens in the middle. This visual actually shows the main things that employees, and this is actually from our employee survey. So this is quantitatively the top 5 things that employees now say they find harder than they did 3 years ago. So, it is teams aligning with one another. It's trying to get focused and not be distracted. It's finding basic information, getting clarity on goals, having the right workflows to suit this more distributed kind of working environment. And this really describes that dangerous zone that I think probably we can all relate to being in way too much of our time, which is, wasteful meetings, having to check on basic things, trying to find stuff, trying to get clarity, indulging those dopamine hits of instant communications that sort of interrupt our day. There is always going to be some of this. There's always probably going to be quite a bit of this, but it certainly shouldn't be the norm. So how do we fix this? Well, it's essentially doing the inverse. It's prioritizing focused work culturally. It's making the effort to provide and reinforce clarity around goals. It's rethinking workflows to avoid much of that kind of low value manual work. 2 specific recommendations I would make is just to rethink meetings. They should be considered a tier 1 engagement, in my view, not the default for conversation. We should be putting much more emphasis on high value asynchronous and visual collaborations over synchronous voice and screen share. You could also think about, training people, as a meta skill on how to run meetings. If you think about all the different things that are involved in them, there's preparation, there's summation, there's focus, there's presentation, there's moderation, there's inclusivity, there's persuasion, there's active listening. It's actually a complex thing to run a good meeting. But as we know, I think for many, the baseline is, do a bit of preparation, say a bunch of stuff, try and moderate a discussion, then bring it to some kind of conclusion. So this is obviously an egregious waste of time and something that I think the appetite for is actually diminishing. I would say the second recommendation would be to think about what tools support you stepping back and taking that wide angle lens on your work. We've found from our own survey work that visual collaboration tools, whether that's diagramming, digital whiteboarding, mapping environments, are increasingly being used to support more strategic kind of decision making, async, daily collaboration, cross-functional collaboration. There are definitely some advantages for those use cases over sort of static screen share, basic conferencing and messaging tools. So a lot to reflect on here, but the essence is to design for deep work, for and for that wide angle lens, try not to get bogged down in that sort of messy morass in the middle. And again, I think the tools are there to support this better than they have historically been, and the necessity is also. So this fourth one really flows from the preceding ones. If you're thinking more strategically about how to design and orchestrate work, you're creating more clarity around goals, teams can therefore better align and focus. Then you're giving them the means to step back and get more clarity. That should help people align, and on and on. You're essentially creating a reinforcing cycle. And this leads to businesses coming to the conclusion, as many have over the past 3 years, that they have to do a much better job of connecting their strategy and their execution. So let's just look at the data around this. It's clear that most companies find this challenging. Plans are difficult to derive, not always actionable. Resources can be difficult to find. The benefits of doing it well, though, are clear: better, faster decision-making, increased clarity, better cross-functional success. This is challenging, though. I think not all leaders like the accountability that comes with being radically clear around goals. Not everyone is good at doing that synthesis thinking of bridging micro and macro goals. Not everyone is sort of operationally minded to crystallize best practices. Like so many of these ideas, it's a culture shift. There are operational cultures that will win based on radical clarity. And of course, it requires leaders who are good at thinking and synthesis, up and down hierarchies and across silos. And of course, this will require teams to also architect their work in a way in which they can generate data against which to validate those plans, which leads us on to the fifth and final recommendation on how to be more productive every day, which is to get used to collecting data to actually inform these different things that you might need to change. Some might find this data counterintuitive. When we think about data and monitoring, we're probably more inclined to think about it negatively, Big Brother watching over our shoulder. However, this data has been clear now consistently in our surveys for a couple of years. And basically what it says is that if it's to recommend productivity improvements, then most employees are okay with the idea of their employer monitoring their devices and applications. Employers and employees alike both want a better conversation around how to change how work happens. In fact, other of our survey data shows that businesses rank productivity analytics amongst the top 3 technologies they think will have game-changing potential for their organizations over the next few years. They're basically looking for data-informed ways to up their game. And so the recommendations I would make is to make this a conversation. Obviously, you don't want to go with, we've decided on these metrics. We're going to observe you. We'll measure you we'll measure your performance against these metrics. Of course, you wouldn't do that. You would say, what data would it be useful to collect? How can that data give us the basis for a conversation on changes we can make? I think my second recommendation would be to think expansively about the use cases this could satisfy. We already see companies using it to, make operational process efficiencies. Lots of things have been made redundant from a workflow point of view over the past 3 years. Companies are using data to rectify that. They're also using it for better resource management and capacity planning, behaviors and activities, providing more visibility around the optimal use of offices and other on-site premises being one example. And then finally, just, taking a more holistic view of workforce planning. Lots of companies use productivity data to model the shift in makeup of different teams and the effects on performance of that shift. They may be using it to do M&A mapping, to inform upsizing, downsizing initiatives. So lots of use cases around using data to inform best practices in workforce operations, which, teams would be better sooner rather than later actually building competencies around. So there's lots you can do to improve your productivity. I'm hoping this was useful and thought-provoking and, just good overall food for thought as you think through some of these productivity and engagement issues. I really hope you enjoyed this presentation. There are my contact details. Please feel free to reach out if you want to ask any further questions or do any kind of follow-up or just connect. And I really hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.